You are listening to the FivesSquared podcast, the podcast where we bring you tips for your business and your life. Our goal is to leave you smarter with ideas, wisdom, tools, and entertained. The FivesSquared podcast is produced weekly for your enrichment. Come back often and feel free to add the podcast to your favorite RSS feed or iTunes. You can also follow me on Twitter at FivesSquared and Facebook. All the links are in the show notes. Now let's get started with your host, business consultant, executive coach, and founder of FivesSquared, Tim Fives.
All right, well, welcome back to the FivesSquared podcast with your host, Tim Fives, and my very special guest, Ryan McShane. Thanks for coming back. We're talking today about conscious capitalism. Yeah, I have conscientious in my brain, so I apologize for that. So, we've been warming up here a little bit. So you were in Vegas.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us a little bit about how Vegas was, what you were doing out there.
Vegas was a great time. So last spring, I had the honor of presenting to the York County Economic Alliance economic breakfast at the Bond, and did a presentation on millennial engagement. And as a result of that, a couple of attendees had seen my presentation and reached out to this International Association of Fairs and Expos and suggested that I be a speaker for their national conference.
Fantastic.
And so before I knew it, I was contacted by the central point of contact for this IAFE annual conference and said, we would love for you to come out and do a presentation. And I said, wonderful, what presentation? They said, millennial engagement. Do you do anything else? And I said, yeah, I do, succession planning. I do leadership, yada, yada. She said, oh, my goodness, succession planning is top of the mind for many of these folks. We would love that presentation, too. Can you do that?
Wow.
So they flew me out to Vegas. I did 2 presentations, and they flew me back.
So on top of being a professor, running a great business, you're also now an international renowned speaker. So fantastic. Oh,
nice to get those experiences under your belt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So today we're talking about conscious capitalism.
We are.
So this is
or conscientious capitalism.
Whatever.
Because you're so conscientious.
I'm trying to be. So I know there's 4 main points, but why don't we run through what you?
So, conscious capitalism. Let's first kind of define what we're talking about. And the best way I think to do that is compare it to traditional capitalism that exists in our country today. Mm-hmm. Traditional capitalism is typically anything that makes money, anything that will produce revenue through the business. And typically that anything can be legal or illegal in some cases. As we've seen through examples of Volkswagen and Enron and different large organizations who have manipulated things to produce revenues above and beyond what they really should have had they been honest and integral.
Yeah.
So what conscious capitalism does is it competes against that from the standpoint of we will only do what is in the best interest of our stakeholders. And so traditional capitalism is highly predicated on what benefits the shareholders of an organization.
Well, I think that's an important differentiation, right? So when we're talking about things, and this is something that people are, even if you look at the tax code and stuff that's coming out, it's like, well, who does that benefit? Well, for the stakeholders, shareholders, like everybody gets that lumped into one thing when you say stakeholders, that it's the shareholders. So why don't you define that, the stakeholders?
Yeah, so the first, the shareholders would be those that would own stock in the particular company. Mm-hmm. And so those folks aren't necessarily invested in the company other than financial investment in the stock, whereas the stakeholders of a company would be anyone who benefits from having an interaction with the company. So it could be the employees, it would be the community, it would be the environment, it would be the vendors and suppliers of that particular company. So those are the stakeholders, the people that are engaged with the company throughout the ecosystem of that entire company.
Yeah, so the supply chain, the people buying the products, everybody.
That's exactly right.
Got it.
That's exactly right. And so what conscious capitalism does is they say, we will set up our operational practices such that we benefit stakeholders, and we will not do anything to the detriment of one of our stakeholders in benefit of another stakeholder. So, in other words, we will not take no action that benefits but provides a detriment to one of the stakeholders. So, let me give you an example of that. What often happens with companies when they want to produce significant amount of revenue in a short period of time and benefit shareholders in terms of the stock value of that company, they will eliminate entire levels of management to reduce overhead within that company to make their books look better.
Right.
So the benefit is immediate for the shareholder, but the negative impact is on that level of employees. And so we have made a decision in benefit of one stakeholder to the detriment of other stakeholders. What conscious capitalism says is we will not do that. Every decision we make will have a benefit for all of our stakeholders. Otherwise, we're not doing it.
Yeah, keep talking. That it brings up a story that I can't manifest in my head at the moment, but about there was a company, they were going out of business, and this was back in 2008, and they were saying, like, how do we stay in business? And the first thing when the board said, well, we need to lay off everybody, and the owners were like, that's not going to happen. And hopefully the name will come to me in a minute, but they go through the whole process of, all right, well, now what do we do, right? So if we're not going to eliminate the positions and the overhead, we need to stay in business. How do we do that? So they came up with a way for the employees to share their vacation, right? So the employees that needed to work because they were financially less sound got more hours, and the people that didn't took their vacation. So they balanced it out, and they ended up weathering the financial crisis they were in.
Wow, huge kudos to that group for being so flexible.
Yeah, I now it's going to bother me. I don't remember the name. So if I don't remember the name, I'll put it in the show notes. But that's the beauty of podcasting. I can always correct myself in the show notes. But but I thought it was an interesting application to what we're talking about today.
Yeah, and so what really pleases me about this approach is it recognizes every stakeholder as an equal stakeholder. And so I think that's very beneficial. When you look at it from a very superficial level, look at organizations like Southwest Airlines. This is a company that when the general market is such that there's high competition across the airlines, and their competitors are laying folks off. Southwest is doubling down at that point and further investing in their employees through training, through resources, through development, because they know that that's where their significant advantage comes from, their employees.
Yeah.
And so they further invest while everybody's laying off, they're investing in their talent. And what that does is it creates the culture and the climate of loyalty towards their employees, as well as an attraction to that kind of environment where they're constantly investing in employees and their growth. And so you can see from a talent management standpoint, they have people lined up for that kind of culture and that environment.
So there was just another article out on this this week, and again, I probably should have printed that out. But there's a company, it's a new startup tech company. Well, I guess it's not a startup, it's been around for about 15 years. And they have a policy: when you're hired for life. Like, you cannot be fired from this company. And I thought, and they went on to say that it was like, well, obviously, because they understood that there's ups and downs in the employee performance. And, it was like, well, if you are having an issue and you're not performing, then we will mentor you through that. The challenge, whether you're going through divorce, or you got sick kids, or you just are burned out, or whatever those things are, so that, but and what they saw is that the performance of that company has gone through the roof. And it was really interesting to think about that. You're like,
Here's what I see that they're doing that other companies are not doing, and I give a lot of respect for and kudos towards that particular company. They're taking care of the whole person. And I think that's critical today. It's more than it ever has been. I think in the past we could easily compartmentalize ourselves and say, I'm willing to do this for a number of hours just to earn money, but that's not who I am. That's not how I feel. That's not what I want to do. And more when we're spending so much time working and we have so many other life issues to balance, it's more important to have greater alignment between what we do and who we are.
Well, I'm a huge proponent, especially when I'm working with business owners and things, is to address the whole person, right? Because if you can't, I don't really believe that people in most terms can compartmentalize things enough where it doesn't impact. Like, oh, I have a sick kid. My wife and I had a fight. We're going through this traumatic thing. It permeates your entire life.
Very much so. And I had this conversation with my college kids over at your college. These are seniors that are getting ready to graduate. And, not a whole lot of conversation has existed for them around what their next chapter is going to look like. So I took the opportunity to say, not just what do you want to do next, but what lifestyle do you want to have? And I think that's a better question to ask in terms of their future, because we've been conditioned for so many years to think about work. And so we've been conditioned to work and consume to a great extent. But have we been conditioned to say, this is what I want my life to look like?
Well, absolutely. And it's almost as parallel to what I tell people, or when I'm working with them. It's, how are you thinking about things, right? Because you don't think about things differently at home than you do here, right? Like, you're either in one mindset of like abundance or you're in one of scarcity and fear, and that transcends the whole continuum. And a lot of those things trigger how you're thinking because of your experiences outside of your work. So if you can get that, when we do the mindset work that we do, it's like, all right, well, that affects everything. So you can't ignore certain pieces.
So true. And years ago, I used to work in Baltimore County, and had a lot of interaction between my agency and the workforce office. And they had recognized that a large part of what they were doing was falling short because they were not addressing the whole person. And in many cases, there were issues of food insolvency and shelter that had to be addressed before work. So a lot of these folks were trying to put the work situation ahead of time, and they didn't have, a roof over their head or any kind of transportation. So, in looking at those things, we have to take care of the whole person in order to make sure that they're going to be successful in their professional role as well.
So coming back to conscious capitalism,
Indeed.
We got 4 main points that you articulated a little bit earlier. So why don't we go through those?
Yeah. So the 4 driving principles of conscious capitalism are conscious leadership, conscious culture, stakeholder orientation, and higher purpose. And so higher purpose, let's start with that, because I think it just lays the foundation for everything else. So in terms of higher purpose, in the context of the professional environment, why are we here? What is the purpose for this particular organization or this collection of professionals, this team that we're gathered around? And if we don't have a clear, consistent sense of the purpose as to why we're all here, then we're going to be operating from different agendas. And all too often, that takes place in organizations. While they have the same vision and mission written on a placard on the wall, we oftentimes have people operating from different agendas, whether it be internal promotion, whether it be revenue accumulation, whatever it may be. If we're not operating towards the same end, then we're swimming in different directions, and we're possibly working against one another. So defining that higher purpose and making sure that we have consistency across that team or organization is fundamental and the first thing to be addressed. After that, we set up the ideology of understanding who our stakeholders are. And I think here again, traditional employment environments only consider the stakeholder as a very small, select group, whereas a more conscious organization will understand that their stakeholders are obviously their employees, as well as their clients, as well as their community, as well as their environment. And I don't know that too often people think about their community in which they live and work as a stakeholder, but obviously it certainly is.
Yeah, we had the pleasure of talking with Tricia Zeltwanger from Penmar. I think you know Trish.
Yep.
But we came in, and it was interesting because they try to get the individuals with disabilities employed and whatnot. I think that's a great mechanism to engage with your community. How do you make that better? How do you get distribute and integrate. It's just one slice of the pie on how to do that, to interact with the community. But there's so many opportunities for that, and I don't think companies even consider that. Like, well, yeah, how can I improve somebody else's life? I get a good deal. They do great work. And then these people have fulfilled lives, and it's just like, why aren't we just doing that? I guess that baffles me. And then you have wonderful people like Trish going around basically selling the concept, and it's just an interesting another point.
Well, I think it comes back to people before profit. And so what we've been raised on, so to speak, has been profit before people, to a great extent.
Well, I think we've all been, that's our society. Yeah.
Yes. So it still is something that maybe through my naivete or just my idealism, but I have trouble wrapping my head around putting profit before people. And I just can't understand how people would do that. But yet, this is what we've been raised and conditioned on. And obviously, as we sit here, we recognize that people are more important than paper money.
Yeah.
It sounds ludicrous to even say.
Right. And I think the other dynamic of that is when you come down to, it's ringing. When you come down to being fulfilled, right? Like your personal fulfillment isn't about money. And I'll argue with anybody that says I'm fulfilled because I make a lot of money. Because I'm pretty sure there's a lot of gaps in that. And if you are great, but the point of the matter is there's so much more to being fulfilled than the paycheck, right? So that's looking at it from the employee, like, all right, well, how do I have a well-rounded life? And then meshing that with an organization that's not like you're a money printer for me, right? You're basically a whore. You're a whore here for my organization to make money. And the companies that and I'm sure you've been through this, been in those where it's all about the money and that's it, and they'll work you right into the ground.
Sure.
Even though you're making a lot, that's you get burned out from that. So,
yeah, but what I'm so fascinated by is the paradoxical standpoint of those people who are so focused on money and profit before people are cutting off their nose to spite their face, because records and research tells us that, and as recently as this week, I saw an article posted by Raj Sisodia, the author of Conscious Capitalism, the book that I told you about.
Yeah, no, I have it on mine.
Yeah. He was going back into his research and looking at some data, and he had posited that those companies who operate from conscious capitalism have experienced a 10,000-fold revenue advantage over those companies that do not operate in this manner. So what I'm saying to you is, while those people that are focused on profit, what they're not realizing is all the opportunity for profit that exists beyond their narrow view of how they're generating profit within that ecosystem.
Well, it's interesting. It's had so many legs. We'll be here for 6-7 hours, everybody. But I joined a mastermind out of Philly, and you should look into this yourself. But the woman that runs it's Terry Levine. She's very well best-selling public author and whatnot. So I got invited down. Long story short, but it's interesting in the concept of a reverse tithing organization, where and what it means is they give away 90% and live and operate on the 10%. And it just struck me. I'm like, that's impressive. Like that's what we want to do here, right? So now you got to build your business to do that, and it's interesting when you get in that different mindset. All the opportunities that we're like, oh yeah, that's how we're going to do this. But it's that, like, how do I give back? How do we give back? And it's a huge thing when I'm teaching the sales things, and it's like, well, how are you adding massive value to your clients? Like before the sale, like just because you're giving. And when I see people that do that, they're going through the roof versus the guy that's like, hey, I'm just going to close the deals. Like I'm just going to go out and I'm going to badger you into submission.
Yeah.
Which I had a recent experience with that with one of the last companies, and it was for me being like, oh, let's just go network and let's get out there, and then we'll add some value, and then we'll add some more value, and by the time we're done, there's a $750,000 deal on the board, like because we built the trust and the relationship, and that, and then you diametrically oppose that with the guys like, well, did you close it? Is it closed? I'm going to go in there. I'm going to get in. it's grating on me when I see people do that. Like, I'm just, you know.
Well, and to that point, there's a lot of power and aggression behind that intention and that perspective of, we got to close, we got to close, we got to close, versus what do we need to do to make sure that this is a great relationship? Yeah. And I think that fundamental question positions you in a better standpoint to earn more revenue and create more value.
Well, the other thing that it does is, even if you don't close the deal, now you have that relationship, and they're going to give you leads and recommendations and things outside of that, versus you go in there and just piss them off because you're badgering them. You haven't built. It's just like point. I should write an article on this, but it's like point selling versus network selling, right? Like, you're coming in, oh, you don't want to buy from me? I don't care. I'm moving on to the next guy. And I don't care that you and I don't have a relationship, so because there's 100 others, versus like, let me develop this relationship because you're not like a good resource. Like, there's that mutual benefit for working with people.
Yeah, yeah, and I think at the very basic level, we're talking about transactional versus relational.
Yeah, well, yeah.
And those folks that are focused on just doing the transaction, they'll get what they get. The minimal transaction. And I think the relationship-focused people will have that foundation for further value and impact with one another, collaborating with one another. Whereas the transaction, I think, is more competitive in nature. Yeah. Just a matter of closing it.
Yep, get it done. So on the 4 points, like, how do you approach an organization? What are the key things to kind of get them thinking in this mode that you would suggest?
Well, what's interesting is these 4 factors of conscious capitalism, again, higher purpose, stakeholder orientation, conscious leadership, and conscious culture, all address the current megatrends that we're facing in the workforce today. And
I love that megatrend.
Well,
kind of reminds me of Transformers.
Yes. And the reason I call them megatrends is because of their sheer number and size and influence. And so let's look at it from the standpoint of the generational megatrend that we're facing. When we look at the fact that we have 78 million baby boomers who are retiring and leaving the workforce, there's only 60 million in Generation X to replace them. So we've got a gap, but yet we've got 80 million coming behind us in the millennial generation. With those sheer numbers and that size, that's a mega impact that's going to reshape how we work.
Absolutely.
The boomers shaped how we work today. We can thank them for the 40-hour work week. And
so I love you guys. You're my peeps, kind of, not really.
And we'll be thanking the millennials when they shift the approach to work once again. And I think we've paved the way in some respects to some of the flexible scheduling, some of the telecommuting, and things of that nature. That's going to only ramp up more with the millennials.
So it was interesting. I was in another meeting, think tank, and they were talking about AI and automation and the significant impact that's going to have on our culture in the next 3 to 5 years. And I'm curious if you had any thoughts on that. Like, the numbers of unemployment and the transformation that's going to bring was staggering. Now, I don't know if I kind of believe it's going to happen. That's just my personal bias. And I think, again, you can look at it in one of 2 ways. Well, a lot of people are going to be unemployed, or there's a lot of opportunity to go out and do other things. And I think we have an opportunity to help train people to be that level of entrepreneurship in this country again when that happens. I'm not saying if anymore, I'm saying when. But I'm curious if that's one of your mega trends that you're seeing on the horizon that's coming at us.
It's not not one that I've long looked into. It's one that's more surfaced recently in my periphery as to something that's going to create an influence. And I've seen those kind of numbers too, and they're a little staggering when you think about how many jobs are expected to be replaced by AI. And I think what we're facing is some of the less technically advanced roles, something that's more administrative in nature, something that is more rote in nature, will be set up for AI. So I think we, as you had indicated, have a challenge before us to shift how we develop people and what we focus on developing them within, what kind of industries and tasks and technologies we develop. So there's definitely a challenge around that. I don't know that AI is one that I focus on too much right now, but it's something that I think we will have to look at.
Yeah.
From a workforce development standpoint.
I just bring it up because it's fresh in my mind, and it was one of those things where, it's like, huh, like that's opportunity, and I think that's another kind of dovetails in when you have these mega trends coming, and if that's one of them, and you're saying the boomers and the transition, how are we preparing
I think
organizations and companies for that?
I think it comes down to leadership. The leadership of any company dictates the culture of that company. That's just the way it is because the leaders call the shots. They frame the environment in which you work. And so when we think about leadership in this country today, I think about that in terms of a leadership crisis. And
really,
there's
a leadership crisis.
Let me explain why I think that. Yes, well,
please do.
Certainly, we only need to look at our recent political environment to see what a crisis it is. But taking a couple steps back from that, let's look at the workforce and how leadership's been addressed over the last 2 generations. So it was very much part of the ethos of the senior or veteran generation to reach back and mentor the baby boomers and provide them tutelage and guidance and apprenticeship. Whereas the baby boomers were coming through and coming up during a time of economic tumultuousness, such that they weren't releasing one hand to reach back to the Gen Xers because they had both hands on their job in a death grip for fear that the Gen Xers would come in and take their jobs because they were younger, they would be paid less, and they saw Generation X as a threat. So as a result of that, Gen X did not receive the informal guidance and tutelage and mentorship and apprenticeship that they, in fact, received from their prior generation, the veterans. And so what's happened now is that also coincided during a time in which training is a luxury we can no longer afford. In other words, economics were such that HR budgets, training budgets were drying up.
Well, that I think is very pervasive when you get into organizations. I know we work on that. It's like, well, how are you managing the knowledge transfer back into the organization?
Indeed.
And I'll give you one example. I was working with a manufacturer. This is quite a while ago with this company, and I was in with the leaders, and they're all like, "Well, we have a big problem." I'm like, "Well, what's your problem?" And they're like, "Well, we keep losing people." Well, okay, well, walk me through it. And they're like, "Well, so they have a manufacturing shop, state of the art. I mean, it wasn't high tech, but I mean, they were making stuff for the HVAC industry." So, but anyway, it's really cool. They had all this stuff, and they're looking at process flows and all this. And then, they're like, "Yeah, but we can't keep management. Like, we can't keep supervisors on the floor." And I said, "Okay." So we're in this room, a bunch of people. I said, "So just walk me through." And I had an inkling of what was going on, but I'm like, "Well, we get these good guys. They come in, they do really good work, so we promote them, and then they leave." So why do you think that is? And like, "We don't know. We pay them more. We do all this." I said, "Well, how are you preparing them for that role?" And you could hear a pin drop in that room. Like it was, okay, well, that's the issue. You just expect them in some miraculous realm to be able to go from stamping metal to leading leading a team and making sure stuff's on schedule. Like,
wholly different competencies, wholly different approach to work, and there's no preparation.
And there was no preparation, and they addressed it, which was good. But it was just really interesting to me where I'm like, it didn't even cross their mind. And they're like, "Well, we're not really sure that's even going to fix it." And I'm like, I'm pretty sure it will. Like, it's at least going to drop your attrition rate by 70%. Right? Because then you come into how much are you paying them? Will they find another job? Will they leave? Well, now you come into cultural issues on the back end of that. But, like, let's stop the bleeding up front and walk them through. And then it came out, well, we don't have anybody to train them. Because there's no, like, it's just the turnover was so
pervasive.
Yeah, that there's no one here. So that was it was just such a really interesting, like, how do you not? But I see that all the time. My last job, it's like, oh, we were doing Salesforce implementations, and we're like, we got to get trained on this, we got to get certified. I mean, it was rote, and then the company's like, nope, just figure it out. And I'm like, no, we're not doing that. Like,
Yeah, and I see that oftentimes with a notion of hire them and forget them. We spent all this time getting them in the door, and then once they're here, we don't do anything with them. We leave them to their own devices to make it on their own, and obviously that doesn't necessarily onboard someone in a way that ingratiates them to the organization or integrates them in a way to be effective and value oriented. So, in terms of back to the leadership, we talked about how they primarily dictate the culture, but we talked about the fact that boomers didn't give it to the Generation X, didn't pass it along in terms of leadership, informal leadership development. And their training budgets dried up, so they didn't have the formal leadership development in terms of classes and certification and so forth. And now we've got another generation coming into the workforce, the millennials. Well, the Gen X doesn't have it to give to the millennials.
Yeah.
So now we have two generations in the workforce, one of which is ready to take the helm from the boomers, and they haven't had any kind of formal or informal leadership development by and large. And so that's a real crisis, a real issue. How are we going to develop people in that capacity? And as you had just pointed out, Tim, the competencies of an individual contributor versus a leader or manager are completely different.
Oh, well, yeah, and I just want to make this distinction because leadership is regardless of a title.
Indeed.
And I've actually turned down a couple clients on this when they didn't get it. Like, no, these are managers, you need to train them. I'm like, no, I can give them a bunch of tactics, but you're not going to get the transformation in your organization you want by giving somebody a bunch of tactics. Right? Because we get into how do you lead and how do you develop that skill. And I think you can develop that skill. And I think people that want to develop the leadership skill can do that if they're pointed in the right direction. But you don't develop leadership by here's a spreadsheet, here's how you fill it in, here's how you're tracking metrics, right? So, because that's when we get companies in that explosive growth mode. It's in the mindset, all right? How are you going to lead? How are you going to let go of control of things that you think you're really good at and allow somebody, like we were talking earlier when you came in, I said, well, like, we can't do this alone, right? You can't run a business alone. A lot of resources around us. Yeah. I'm fortunate to have Devin working for me, and it's like, okay, I know I can figure this out, and I know I probably do pretty quick, but I don't. It's not the best use of my time. He can learn while he's doing it. Go get it done. And then he's like, well, I got to figure this out. I'm like, yeah, you do. And then he does, and then the organization's better off because now I don't have to think about it. He's got that. Now, the downside is that I'm somewhat dependent on that. But I'm all right with that because that's a risk. And if I can develop him to be a better person and have better skills and go out into the workforce beyond after working for me after I die of a heart attack, then so be it. Great. Yeah. But that was for my wife.
Well, it's interesting because the conscious leadership that I'm proposing has a model of leadership, and there are all different types of models of leadership out there, and we're certainly all familiar with the autocratic model of leadership, the notion of top-down, hierarchical, command and control, do what I tell you because I'm your boss, that kind of positional power, which really doesn't motivate or invest people in the process. It initiates people to respond from a standpoint of protectionism. Yeah. And therefore, what that elicits is minimal compliance, just enough to do enough to get by without getting in trouble.
I think there's only one application that I think that works, and I think it's in crisis mode. Mm-hmm. Right. So if you have this leadership, and I've seen this, whether it's software development or the financials of a company are going down, and you've got to make a hard turn fast. I think the structure seems to work. Like, hey, I've been here before. I can get it done. I need you to follow me. I'm the leader. I'm going to take over. But the leadership qualities are still around that. Because people are like, oh, all right, he's got a plan. We're going to follow. We're going to get him behind him. And we're not going to question it, right? Because that slows things down. It's like, all right, we're going to make these. We're going to make quick decisions. We're going to execute and go. But that's not sustainable over years, right? Yeah. Like, and I think that we've kind of gotten into that as well, where people are just like, oh, well, that worked for the short term, so we're going to do that in perpetuity.
You're exactly right. I mean, that's a way of operating in a given situation and scenario, and is not long term. And so the servant leadership model is what is described and articulated under conscious capitalism. And so servant leadership basically says a leader is in the role to make sure that they equip their followers with all the resources necessary to perform at their highest levels.
Yeah.
And doesn't that work much better than having all these people serving one person? I mean, think about the capability enabling that is taking place by having the leader equip all the followers to operate at their highest capability versus all the followers serving that one leader in their agenda.
We had this was one of the pivotal points in my career, I think, and just from going back thinking about it, but it was at a Fortune 100 company, and the numbers were in the gutter, and everybody, we were all living in fear, right? It's like, oh my God, when is it going to come? It's right at the turn of the downturn, the recession. We got new leadership at the top of the organization, and they came in and said, well, here's the deal. Like, and before, and I hadn't been there very long, like, fortunate to get in there, but it was really not culture. And I remember sitting there and being like, what did I just do? Holy shit, I'm working with this company and it's a disaster. But anyway, and they're all like, we're not sure how we're going to do it. And since this division didn't hit our numbers, we're all going to get laid off. And this guy came in. It was a quarterly meeting. I was sitting in the room, and he's like, here's the deal. I'm new. We're in trouble. Here's the number that we have to hit. And it was like the first time where people were like, what? You're sharing these numbers with us? Mm-hmm. And he's like, I don't care how you fix this, but I'm empowering all of you to figure it out.
Refreshing, isn't it?
And everybody's like, and so we're like, oh, all right. So now all of a sudden ideas started coming up, and I was fortunate enough to be running it. It wasn't a significant group, but it was big enough where I'm like, wow, yeah, I did our number, because we weren't confined to the paradigm of the past of like, all right, well, utilization's this or that. And so we started looking at the overall revenue model and saying, all right, how do we hit that number? Yeah. What we've got, and how do we get creative about it? Because the other metrics didn't matter. Like, utilization wasn't a huge concern, because we knew if we were doing the right things, utilization would take care of itself. Mm-hmm. So we changed it. We were able to change the focus, but it all stemmed from that guy saying, like, here's the open kimono. We're in a world of hurt. You're all super high performing individuals. Help me figure this out. And then over the year, we got through it. We didn't, we let some people go, but not like the calling that they were saying. And then we came and said, all right, well, this is what really worked well. Now, how do we optimize that? And it was one way to kind of shatter the old paradigm of how they were doing business. So.
And it's that examination that is not lost on this process of conscious capitalism. There is a practice of standing back and looking at, how do we want to be? How do we want our stakeholders to see us? Mm-hmm. And so from examining that, we have a much greater propensity towards initiating that for our stakeholders, rather than saying, this is the direction I'm going, and however it appears, and if people want to jump in, they can jump in. But we're examining how we want to appear to other people, and that comes down to influence of the culture. So once we have the leadership who's defined, we want to operate from this servant leadership modality. We're going to be conscious leaders in that we're going to examine how we want to come off as leaders, how we want to impact our stakeholders. And then from the standpoint of what culture that creates, we know that will influence the kind of people that want to be in this environment. Mm-hmm. And so when we have a conscious culture, it says, how do we want to interact with one another? How are we going to address conflict when it comes up? And I don't know that many organizations really look at those kind of things. Conflict's inevitable. Why don't we set some ground rules right up front to say, this is what we're going to do when it rears its ugly head?
Yeah, Devin and I, we go out in the parking lot and kick each other.
Put on the boxing gloves.
Let's go a couple rounds.
Yeah. But that's, from a project management standpoint, that's something that I did with all my projects, is I would come in and say, all right, let's develop the ground rules together of how we want to interact with one another. What's appropriate? Well, we want everyone to arrive on time. We want everyone to, speak their mind, et cetera.
Well, it was interesting. So at EMC, the last role I had there was going in and bringing projects out of right before they were going into litigation. Right, they were right off the rails, and it was just like, and I, after doing a couple of them, I'm like, well, my wife's like, how's it going to go? I'm like, I'm going to tell you exactly how it's going to go. I'm going to walk in there. I'm going to meet with the lead. That lead's going to be mad, and he's going to blame it, or her will blame everybody else. And they're going to give me a list of 100 excuses. Generally, it's blaming the vendor. Fair enough. So I'm going to take that beating. But then I'm going to walk into the work groups, and they're going to be separate. And nobody will be looking at each other. No one will be talking. And the only communication will be via email and sniping when I'm in there. And then I'm gonna have to break it all down and start over. And now at that level, it's like, well, I'm gonna have to call people out and get rid of you. You're done, and then bring a team in to do remediation and things. But the fundamental thing is how do we get everybody back on the same page? It was, those were, then again, like, it was great experience. I don't know if I want to get back into crisis management projects like that, but it's just interesting when you're enabled. But the other thing when I would go in is like, I have to have full control of this to turn this around. And getting the client on board, like look, we can get this fixed. Like, it's technology. Like, this will work. You know, like, we're not putting a guy on the North Pole of Mars, right? So, like, so that was always an interesting thing of thought, where you're like, all right, now how do we get everybody back? And then so it's sustained, because like, you can fix an issue, but can you sustain that? Because any project, and no matter what industry you're in, is going to run into issues.
Absolutely.
So communication's huge, and open communication is also huge. Like, if you don't like what somebody's doing, then you need to have the courage to say, I don't like that, in a nice, not necessarily a nice way, but in a considerate way, so that you're like, can you just explain to me so I have an understanding of why you're doing what you're doing, so that I have an appreciation for it.
And I think what this does is it brings the focus back to the humanistic aspect of work. And, I think this puts the person at the center of the organization, and the center of focus, rather than systems being at the center of focus. And I think that's an important distinction, because I've seen all too often systems where the tail's designed to wag the dog. And we set up these systems to mitigate any kind of decision-making and logical decision-making to take place. And what's scary about that is we all too often follow the system rather than following our logic and what we know to be the best, intention or way of going about something for the best outcome. And so conscious capitalism puts the focus back into the person at the center, and realizes we are energetic beings at our core. And as a result of that, the environment has a significant influence on how we feel, and how we engage, and how we interact. And those are all the things that we have to do on a regular basis in the work environment. And so if there's an environment that elicits a great deal of stress for the individual employee, expect that their work capacity is going to be diminished by a minimum of 20%.
Oh, yeah, easily. And it's interesting you talk about energy, right? So this is, and I think that comes back to the mindset as well, right? Because that affects that. And just if being self-aware on your own energy and your own state has that. So, like, are you going into toxic, and I come back to those environments and why it was so draining for me. I didn't figure this out until later. All the negative energy in there, you walk into those environments, and it just was a suck. And I can never understand, like, why am I so tired? Like, I'm coming out of these things. It's one of the reasons why I left the company, because I didn't realize it then. All I knew is that I was exhausted, and I hated going to places like Hot Springs, Arkansas. Nothing. There's a lot wrong with Hot Springs. No, I'm just kidding. Not kidding. But anyway, when you're working out of a burned out Walmart, it wasn't the most. But anyway, the point of the matter is, it really drained it, and I could never figure out. It wasn't until probably the past couple of years, through my own mentors and coaches, it was like, well, that's why. Like, you're this guy, you go and you light up a room, you're full of energy and all this, and you go into this vat of negative energy. Well, you only got so much, and there was nowhere for you to, like, plug back in and get recharged. I'm like, well, I'm like Superman. Anyway, but
I certainly recognize and have had those situations in my career as well, to the point where it took, in reflection, it took monumental effort to go to that job
Mm-hmm.
and even remain there at that desk all day long.
Yeah, and I remember telling my wife, I said, I can no longer get on the plane.
Mhm.
I can no longer, there's just nothing left.
Mhm.
And I think that comes back to that culture, right? Because if you have that culture
Right.
that's coming around and saying, hey, it's effervescent, we're communicating well, and it's in a positive light, you can keep people plugged into that energy.
You're exactly right. You can sustain it if there's value that's demonstrated for the effort that you're putting in. And once it's recognized that there may not be recognized value for what you're doing, you feel much more like a cog in the system and
Yeah.
not someone who's actually having an impact.
Yeah, and I think it also builds up a reserve when there are hard times. Like oh, well, we got that. It's like all right, well, we're all in this together. Yeah, we're all a little down, but we'll all proceed and figure this thing
It's
out.
the old emotional bank account.
Yeah.
You're exactly right.
So I guess I'm getting older and wiser. A few more white hairs.
So, when you look at culture, that has one of the most profound impacts on talent management. And what I mean by that is the companies that are consistently rated as top places to work and are the most profitable companies are conscious capitalism organizations. And I'll give you an example of that. Um, Google, Southwest Airlines, Container Store, Target, Whole Foods was one of these. So these are organizations that you'll open a Fortune 500 magazine or Fortune magazine, and you'll see them listed in top places to work across the United States and why they're the top places to work. And it's always comes down to culture and how they treat their employees as a result of their culture. But these are viable companies because of how they treat their employees, and their employees are engaged and invested in what they're doing. It's the companies that don't bother to engage their employees that will only get minimal compliance and as a result diminish their revenue returns and have a great deal of turnover.
Yeah. Now you always have an anomaly, and I'm going to call out an anomaly as Amazon because if anybody's been reading the news, we see how shitty they're treating their employees.
Yeah.
And then you have the fact that they bought Whole Foods, and it'll be interesting to watch that, and I will watch that, and I think you will as well. The clash that's going to end up happening.
Indeed.
And it's very interesting to me that Amazon has had the success they did, and I think it's just brute force and the fact that they don't care about anybody, and they've got the market and things, but the fact that's going to be a huge clash, and that was one of the things when that happened. I'm like, how does that work? Like that just doesn't make any sense. Like from a business, yes, the distribution, they're doing food, they have Amazon Fresh and all that, and I get that, but like culturally.
Yeah.
They're about as far apart as you can get.
Yeah, and that's where we see through mergers and acquisitions a lot of, they often fail, mergers and acquisitions as a result of the culture and not addressing the mixing of these two different cultures. So you're right, it will be interesting to see how this rolls out. Now, this particular organization is highly run on AI, as you had talked about, the influence of AI. I think we're going to see it to a great extent in the transportation and logistics industries. Yeah. And so when you see that, it takes away the humanistic aspect that we're talking about from a cultural standpoint, whereby we're delivering services through this AI. Now, it goes back to the standpoint of we need some conscientious and conscious folks behind the scenes to make the decisions that go into the programming around the AI to ensure service is still upheld. And if that's not taking place, we're going back into a transactional mode of being.
Yeah. I think that's one of the great fears, and you just hit up a couple. You got transportation is going to be disrupted, both airline and car manufacturers, and that the whole supply chain around that. I think AI and automation is going to just dismantle that. Same thing with the airlines. And then you get into the service business, like the kiosks at McDonald's, right? Like all that stuff can be automated, right?
Yeah.
And it's just, I think that's going to be it's a fundamental opportunity. And I think it's a great puzzle to be able to figure, like, well, what are these people going to do?
Yeah.
Like, what can you be doing with this? Because we'll figure it out.
Absolutely will.
Yeah.
So, I'm just continuously amazed by this mode of operating within organizations called conscious capitalism, because it is truly the ideal model of how organizations can operate with a focus on the individual, a focus on the person, and a more humanistic aspect of how we all interact and work with one another to realize the purpose of that particular organization. And we can put it in the context of the vision or mission. And so these organizations, do you think that they have to look for talent? Absolutely not. It lines up at the door waiting to come into that environment. And so organizations who say, like you had said, they can't hold on to talent, they can't hold on to even management, let alone top talent. So that, I think, is the best indicator of any, that they need to take a pause for the cause and look at what their culture is doing to their organization. Is it further enabling people to be more successful? Or is it looking at how we can reduce cost and yield the highest revenue?
Yeah, so it just hit me while we're chatting. I think the other thing that does when you're only looking at the cost, and like I wrestle with this too, because I'm a risk taker. Like I'll spend money like no one's business. I'm really good at it. But when you're
Christmas is coming up, by the way.
Yeah, is it?
Yes. I take a medium.
But when you're in that whole cost and top line, right? Like I'm going to cut cost, make top line. Like you've lost the ability in my mind, and I've seen this a lot, to think outside the box. To think about, well, what's new revenue streams? What's another way that I can add value, that I can charge for it, and create that? And it was the one thing at EMC when we were going through that downturn that that gentleman just uncorked. Because he's like, look, this is the delta, right? I don't care what the top line is. I don't care what, like, the delta is X million in between it. Fix it. So what it did is it's like, oh, well, it wasn't about, well, I need to cut costs. It wasn't, it was like, well, how do I drive more business, right? Like, and that's the mindset. And then all of a sudden we're like, well, we can set up annuities. We can do this. We can do some strategic planning. We can come back. And then all of a sudden and I remember this, I was with a professor from Oxford. He worked with us. He's one of the smartest guys I've ever known. A little eccentric. Reminds you of Higgins from Magna Pi. But anyway, we're out there, and he's like, "What if we did this?" I have and I always remember this guy because he was a great individual, but he's the kind of guy that if you sat down and had beers, and we'd like to have beers when we were traveling, I was mentally exhausted. Mm-hmm. Like it was like all the horsepower. And I'm a pretty fairly intelligent individual, but I'm just like, I'm tired. Okay. And so one day I think we were in London, or maybe, let's call London for now. But, we're sitting there at this pub, and he's going on about all these great facts. And I said, that's all well and good. And I really don't give a shit. What I care about is doing it. And it was kind of like, well, this is how we do it. And it's like that I can run with. So we built this new team out of that. But it was really kind of an interesting thing where he's like, well, I'm just going to go out and do this. And, I don't really care about the cost. But once that we were uncorked, it was like, oh, that's a great idea. Let's go sell this to the United Nations, which we did. Let's go out and do this to FDIC and Amtrak and these huge organizations, and we did it. And it was fantastic. So, but that never would have manifested itself had we not been, as I said, let off the chain. So
yeah,
good deal. Well, I think we'll cap it here. I can go on about this for hours, but fantastic conversation. Thanks so much for coming in again.
Always a pleasure, Tim.
We'll get you on the calendar for the next year, new year. And there'll be a lot in the show notes on this, on Conscious Capitalism, Ryan's website. And do you have any collateral from did they video or do anything of you doing your talks out in Vegas?
No, they didn't do any video or anything like that. I imagine there's a couple pictures in the woodwork, but I'll see if I can find this.
We'll hook everybody up with your social and your websites.
Great.
And thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me, Tim. Always a pleasure.
It's my pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you so much for listening to the show with your host, Tim Fives. We hope you will pass along our web address, FivesSquared.com, to your friends and colleagues. Be sure to check out our archives section on our website for previous podcasts. Follow us on Twitter at FivesSquared or follow us on Facebook. This has been a FivesSquared production. Join us next time for another edition of the FivesSquared podcast.